Professor Dr. David Armstrong, é professor na Universidade de Southern California, fez mestrado em reparação de tecidos e cicatrização de feridas pela University of Wales College of Medicine e é PhD pela University of Manchester. Fundador e co-diretor da Southwestern Academic Limb Salvage Alliance e co-diretor da American Diabetes Association Clinical of Care of the Diabetic Foot. Thank you very much for coming. After your lecture, we will do an overview, a quick overview, okay, making easier for people doing the questions, okay? Thank you very much.
Oh, no, the pleasure is absolutely mine. Thank you, Professor Santos. If I was late, I apologize. I thought we were starting at 4 p.m. Local and not 3, but that's okay. I'm happy to be here.
We understand.
And we're all part of the family. So you're very, very welcome. And we'll get started and let's make this happen. Should I just share my screen?
Yeah, I think that you can.
Let's do it. All right. I'm excited. Here we go. And can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Más o menos, as we say. There we go. That's good. And en español, pero not in Portugués.
Great.
Entiendo todo en español, pero I don't speak. I'm so sorry for my lack of. I have so many friends in Brazil from Porto Alegre into Amazonia and everywhere in between. And to be able to talk to you now, even during the pandemic, is such a pleasure.
Yes.
And it's such an honor. And I'm happy to be with you. And we'll try to cover stuff now. We have Vera. We have 30 minutes? Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Good. I'll hurry up. If I start going over, I'll try to stay under. If I go over, you come back on and bother me and cut me off or something. Put me on mute. How does that sound? We'll make this happen. But it is my pleasure to be with you. And we'll be talking about the diabetic foot, and we have slides here, and we just give away our slides. So if you want any of them, then just email me or tweet at me, and I'm happy to send them to you. It's a pleasure. We just ask you to copy them and make them better and pay it forward. How does that sound? So what we are going to talk about now as a family is about a problem that maybe a lot of people don't really care very much about, which is diabetes. But it is Diabetes Month right now. And we're going to be talking about within diabetes, something that very few people care about, which is the foot in diabetes. And after that, we're going to be talking not about wounds, but really what happens in between these wounds, or that is the diabetic foot in remission. So it's a little bit something different, but we're going to talk about how we can marry our teams as nurses, as physicians, as surgeons, as therapists with technology and a little bit of tenacity. How does that sound? So that's the big idea. And so this is what I do. I'm a foot doctor, and I look after patients with diabetes. But as a foot doctor, I can't think of anything that is more of an expression of humility than looking after the feet. It doesn't matter what country you're in, whether you're in São Paulo, whether you're in Los Angeles, whether you're in Amazonia, whether you're in London. It's the same thing. It transcends borders, and it's an expression of humility. But one of the other cool things that it does is it is looking after the foot at the end of the body, is that it gives us a really great expression, or a great perspective. And it's a unique perspective when you work out there at the end of the body, and it forces you to collaborate with everyone else on the anatomic mainland on this peninsula. And the trouble right now is that things aren't so good right now at the end of the body. And I'll show you this video if you can see it. This is the first video of any surgery ever recorded and it's Professor von Bergmann in Germany doing an amputation. Look at that, back 119 years ago. And you see the smartest person in the room, that's the nurse in the back. She's upset that the professor's not wearing gloves. But the learning point here is not what's going on here on the screen, but it's what's happening maybe to this person to the right of the screen. And the fact is that this person probably had a better outlook on life in 1901 with an amputation than some people around the world having an amputation with diabetes right now in 2020. So there's a lot we can do about that. But the first thing that we have to understand as a family is that the truth hurts right now. And that is that complications in the diabetic foot, they're common, they're complicated, and they're costly. So let's go through these things. First, let's talk about how common they are. If we just look north of the border up into the United States, there are about maybe 350 million people in the United States. There are maybe now about 34 million people with diabetes, and about half of them have neuropathy or loss of protective sensation, and another half have peripheral artery disease. And there are a few million people now living in the United States, but also in Brazil, with diabetic foot ulcers or with things like severe peripheral artery disease or just with amputations. So there's a lot of these folks around the world. Let's look at these data. If we look at this, a couple of years ago, we looked at the World Health Organization data for years lived with disability. And diabetes, I'll just show you here, diabetes is a top 10 condition by itself. But when we take the limb, when we disaggregate just foot problems with diabetes, the foot problems by themselves are a top 10 condition in the World Health Organization's years lived with disability. And there are plenty of people talking about other problems around the world that are on this list. But I know that we right now are the only people talking about feet in diabetes. So you want to talk about a massive problem that is not being met. There you are. And if we look at this is additional data just from a few months ago. We're seeing that no matter where you live in the world, complications associated with the foot in diabetes are increasing. And this is true in every region of the world. And it could be throughout South America and Brazil specifically. It could be in North America and Canada and the United States. It's everywhere. So this problem is only increasing. It is not decreasing. And it is also a very, very complicated problem. If we look at this, what we see is that the risk for hospital admission and for people with ulcers and foot infections in this study, where we looked at 5 billion outpatient visits in the United States over several years, we see here that these problems with diabetes are, I think, at least as problematic as these other problems that we know are big, like cancer or heart disease or renal disease, et cetera. So we see this problem as common and complicated, but really the next idea is what about its cost? And here's the real cost. And let's kind of look at it in this way. What we know right now is that every 1.2 seconds, someone around the world develops a diabetic foot ulcer. And then about half of those get infected, which is why every 20 seconds, someone around the world undergoes an amputation. And what we would like to say as a family around the world is that time's up, because we need to work together as nurses, as physicians, as surgeons, and as policymakers to try to prevent problems from spiraling out of control and it costing patients limbs and lives. So let's continue discussing all the bad stuff, and then we'll get into the good stuff. But I will just touch on this. Very few people care about diabetes, and even fewer people really care about feet in diabetes, but everyone I know cares about cancer. We have all had a family member who has survived cancer or has succumbed to cancer or is living with cancer. So let's compare these terrible problems with one another together as a family. First, let's look at the cost. These are data from a few years ago from our group and a group in Houston, Neil Barshis and coworkers. It's really quite amazing. In the United States now, the diabetic foot, lower extremity complications of diabetes now are more expensive in terms of direct costs than the 5 most expensive cancers. It's amazing. And this is also true in Health Canada. It's true in parts of the European Union, especially, and in the National Health Service in England. This is true now in parts around the world. It's been repeated. Now let's also look at this. These are very recent data. What we see here now is if we look at mortality, problems like amputation, from major amputation to people living with vascular disease to people just living with ulcers in general, I think we can say these are at least as bad in terms of 5-year mortality as a bad form of cancer. So I think collectively, what we have to understand is how better to communicate this problem, not only amongst ourselves as nurses and physicians, as surgeons, but as with our patients in terms of this complications, and with healthcare, with policymakers, health ministers in Brasilia, in Washington, D.C., and around the world. Let's continue with this cancer analogy, and then we'll talk about some good stuff and some technologies, and then we'll close. How does that sound? We had a paper recently in the New England Journal of Medicine where we looked not only at foot ulcers and diabetes, but we looked at their recurrence. So how do these patients develop ulcers? Well, what happens very briefly is people with diabetes, they get neuropathy, and they can get basically sensory neuropathy and wear a hole in their foot by getting a callus, just as we wear a hole in a sock or a shoe. And that hole is called an ulcer. That's what happens every 20 seconds around the world. And it's accentuated not only by neuropathy, but by peripheral artery disease. And that's why about half the time, once you get this problem, people don't feel it, so it gets infected. It leads to hospitalizations and ultimately amputations. This is kind of the cycle that we see. So how do we prevent this problem? Well, what we can do by treating these patients appropriately, by debriding and offloading and providing good quality care, we can heal a lot of these patients. But once they're healed, are they really healed? Let's look at these data. This is also from that paper and that manuscript. And we see that after 1 year, about 40% of these patients are going to have another ulceration on their feet. It's about 2/3 recurrence at 3 years and about 3/4 or so at 5 years. So the answer here is that recurrence in this patient population is not only common, it's likely. So if the foot in diabetes is a little bit like cancer, then maybe when people are healed, maybe they're not really healed, maybe they're in remission. And this word, remission, it sounds like we're just using words, and sometimes words don't matter. But sometimes they do. And I think in this case they do, because when we describe this to our patients, when we say, Mrs. Garcia, thank God you're healed, but you know what? You're not healed. You're in remission. There's a very good chance that you're going to get another ulcer in our long life together. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to get you in the right shoes. We may have to operate on you if you have another wound or if you have vascular disease, but we're going to be working together as a family. And when you compare the problem to cancer and you talk about remission, at first they stiffen up a little bit, but then they understand that there's a way forward, just like with cancer and being in remission from cancer, and that these patients need to be followed for their whole life. It's not just one-stop shopping. And what's really great now is that this has caught on in health ministries around the world. This is great work from the National Health Service in Scotland. They've taken this work and they have really made a difference across an entire country of 8 million people in Scotland. Now they can classify people as low, moderate, and high risk and in remission and apply appropriate resources to this population and make a difference in triaging patients to good quality nursing care and physician care, and making and stopping this problem before it starts. But let's look here briefly just at these top 3 things for causing diabetic foot recurrence. It's patients with neuropathy, patients with peripheral artery disease, and patients with a pre-ulcerative lesion. So what do we mean by a pre-ulcerative lesion? Well, it's this. It's a callus. And this callus looks so simple and basic, but you see here already, it looks like one toe is gone, one piggy has gone to market, if you will. But this callus, how do we describe this callus to another nurse or to another doctor or to their patient? Well, if the foot is a little bit like, in diabetes, is a little bit like cancer, then maybe a callus is a coming event, and it's like a breast lump. And we can describe this to our patients, and they understand this when they're self-examining or when their family member is doing that. I just will share that with you. And now for the last 10 or 15 minutes, let's rush through a lot of this stuff and talk about ways forward in treating these patients as we move on to try to extend ulcer-free days in remission, looking at these various technologies. So we've already talked about this. In the face of neuropathy, there's really kind of an equation that has 2 variables. It's pressure and activity. And we can modify pressure by modifying the shoes the patients wear, getting them into good offloading and protective devices. We can modify people's activity, but it's really an activity and pressure imbalance that causes these simple little diabetic foot ulcers that become complicated ones that lead to gangrene and amputations every 20 seconds. How do we do that? How do we bring that activity pressure imbalance into balance? Well, maybe we can start dosing activity like we dose a drug. In the past, it's been very difficult to do this, but this is an old slide that I have, but I postulated many years ago that maybe just like we're dosing a drug, if you have a peak too high and you might have toxicity, in this case, too high and you might have an ulceration. In a drug, too low and you don't get the good effects of the drug, too low here and you don't get the good quality effects of the cardiometabolic benefits of activity. But maybe we can coax people into a little bit better activity slowly if we can monitor them. And in the past, we couldn't do this. But what's so cool now is that we're starting to be able to. And if we look at the beautiful gait in patients that have a normal gait pattern, it's in amazing balance. The body is just an amazing machine. But when we add diabetes into the mix, when we add other problems into the mix, it really can go out of balance, and so can patients' activity. And I will show you this. What we have seen is that patients' activity before they ulcerate can actually be wildly variable. And what's pretty cool now is through simple tools like a flip phone or an activity monitor or their regular phone now, we can identify people's activity and predict when they are going out of that variability very inexpensively, and then alert them when they're about to get an ulcer. This is pretty cool. And we're starting to work on this much, much more in our unit and many others around the world. Another thing we can do now is we have all these really cool ways of dosing activity like we dose a drug. This is a really cool smart shirt that has a accelerometer built into it, or even smart pendants that are built into it, where we can see people walking, crawling, prone, supine, in all these different positions. And these tools now are getting very, very inexpensive. They used to be thousands and thousands of dollars. Now, many of them are just very, very inexpensive for our patients. And so that's the activity portion. But how do we detect that? Well, these are two of my mentors. This is Professor Paul Brand, and this is Professor Andrew Bolton, and that's me. I carry their bags for them. I don't carry his bags anymore. He died about maybe 15, 17 years ago. But Professor Brand, way back in the day, he said this. He said that wounds will heat up before they break down. And what did he mean? What he meant was that if we look at temperature on these feet and legs, we can identify wounds that are about to break down through simple thermometers and through even more fancy thermographs. And we look for these asymmetries and we can predict it. Let me show you. This is so cool. This is just from our clinic on an iPhone. You can also use an Android device where we have a very simple little device that actually attaches to it. And we can look at a person here with an ulcer and Charcot-arthropathy. And we see that ulcer and that Charcot-arthropathy that's about to break down just on our simple phone now. And these things are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and easier now to use. And we see that these wounds really will heat up before they break down. And what we can do now for our patients through very inexpensive tools is we can give them thermometers that cost less now than $10 US, and we can give them guidelines to return to activity just by checking their skin temperature and dosing their activity like they would check their glucose and dose their insulin. This is very real, and it's happening right now in our clinics in the United States and around the world. We don't have time to go into this too much, but what's really cool is that there have been these startups now. This is a startup in Boston that have developed a smart bath mat, which goes in the bathroom and identifies these hot spots on the foot and will alert the patient if they have a hot spot that's about to cause an ulcer. And it'll alert them and it'll say, Ms. Sanchez, you have a wound on your big toe. And we need you to get in now to see your nurse and your doctor now. This is now happening in clinics in the United States and in other parts of the world. And devices like this, because companies will come and go, but devices and this idea of remote patient monitoring, or RPM, is really here to stay. And we can move up the body now from bath mats to socks. We've been working with smart textiles for many, many years. They've been getting less and less expensive. And entire companies now have started in this area. A young lady, Ran Ma, started a company called Siren. She approached us about 5 or 6 years ago and said she had read some of our studies. She goes out with 5 of her friends and starts a little startup. And they have a smart sock that looks like a regular sock. You can put it in the washing machine and it checks skin temperatures. It attaches to a smartphone and then it can alert you when you're about to get a wound. She takes this study or this device to the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, which is this awesome meeting where there are 300,000 people. And she enters into this contest 3 years ago against augmented reality and virtual reality and all these devices. And reality ends up winning. So this little company looking with socks and feet end up taking this top prize at this big meeting. It was unbelievable. And what we saw was that there are companies like this now that are starting to make a difference. Similarly, we're now seeing smart shoes and insoles take off. This is a group from Zoltan Pataki in Geneva, that have a smart insole that can identify where we think now a high pressure area and then get out of the way and offload, hopefully ultimately in real time. We're working on things like this now too with shape memory alloys. And then, all these wearables are cool, but what if we could put wearables together with, get this, with injectables? So this is now a thing. And Natalie Wisniewski and others at Profusa, along with one of my friends, Miguel Montero Baker, who is one of our old trainees, a vascular surgeon, did the first human studies by injecting a sensor under the skin, very, very inexpensive little sensor that you can hit with a laser and identify, amongst other things, oxygenation. And tools like this are initially very expensive, but then they become much less expensive when they're more widely used, because then we can identify tissue oxygenation, even potentially at home or things like, or even in the community. And I think these implantable sensors are going to become more and more common around the world. So you're going to have injectables along with wearables. And this is the last thing I'll show you. This is so cool. This is from a group called GraftWorks. They have a smart blood vessel after you do a bypass on patients, the clock is ticking as well. Wouldn't it be nice to know when that bypass was going to fail before it ever failed? And wouldn't it be nice to know it as soon as possible? What if you could do it at home? So this is a blood vessel made out of Gore-Tex that you can pair with using Bluetooth in the operating room. And one of my friends, Rich Neville, has been working on this tool along with Craig Weinkoff, who was one of our trainees who did the first animal studies on this. And this is a tool now that actually can work to identify turbulent flow after a bypass at home. And so I think people will have subscriptions to these tools that are on them and in them to identify things. And the key things, the masters of the universe, are going to be people that can make these things communicate. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude with this brief slide. I'll show you this because I play football for most of my life. I'm a soccer player, and I play goalie, and I love football. I saw this video and I thought you would enjoy it. And when I saw this video, my friend sent it to me, I thought to myself, this is me. Because, the thing about if you're a goalie, you miss one ball and everyone hates you. If you're a striker, you can take 20 shots and make one and you're a hero. And I kind of feel this way in clinic, I kind of feel like a goalkeeper. But when I saw this video, it reminded me of how I feel, kind of sometimes looking a little bit stupid, but somehow still being in position to make a save. And this reminded me of a great quote, and it was from the great Mason Cooley. And he said, if you position yourself well enough, circumstances will do the rest. And I believe that. And you're all graduating now, going out into the world with new knowledge. And what it really is all about is positioning yourself well enough. And if you do that, you can make a difference. And in our little area, hopefully, we can make a difference in keeping a few more legs on a few more bodies and helping people move through the world a little bit better, no matter what their health and no matter what their age. Professor Santos, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It's an absolute honor and privilege.